Silence reigns in the early morning of June 22, 1941. Within the thick walls of Brest Fortress, Soviet soldiers and their families sleep soundly, secure in the knowledge that their fortress has withstood centuries of wars and conquests. Suddenly, the stillness shatters. The first rounds of German artillery pound the fortress, tearing into its mighty walls and sending bricks flying. The stronghold begins to crumble, and chaos erupts as Soviet soldiers are jolted from their sleep. Dust and smoke fill the corridors as families scramble for safety. Border guards at the gates seize their weapons and meet the invaders head-on. With rifles, bayonets, and raw determination, they push back the first waves of German troops. Women rush to administer first aid to the wounded, while children dash through corridors, delivering food to desperate defenders. For the soldiers of Brest Fortress, there is no retreat and no reinforcements as they prepare to give Hitler's unstoppable Blitzkrieg its first taste of Soviet resistance. A fatal alliance. In the early years of World War II, Germany unleashed a new kind of warfare that left Europe reeling. The Nazi Blitzkrieg, or Lightning War, was an unprecedented display of mechanized destruction. Within months, Adolf Hitler's forces toppled nation after nation with ruthless efficiency, sweeping through France, Nordic countries, and Eastern Europe in a campaign no one seemed to be able to stop. At the center of this rampage lay Poland, the first victim of Hitler's insatiable ambitions, a nation crushed under the weight of a secret alliance between Germany and the Soviet Union. Just days before the invasion, the two powers signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a non-aggression treaty with a hidden protocol seeking to divide Eastern Europe into zones of conquest. This pact sealed Poland's fate. Germany would seize its western territories, while the Soviets claimed the east. On September 1, 1939, Germany unleashed its full might, launching a hellish invasion under the false pretext of Polish aggression. The Blitzkrieg came like a torpedo. Columns of tanks smashed through Polish defenses, while relentless waves of Luftwaffe bombers eclipsed the blue skies, reducing towns and cities to rubble. Infantry and artillery followed in a devastating tide, overwhelming Poland's rashly assembled forces. The Polish army, hampered by incomplete mobilization and outdated strategies, fought valiantly to hold their ground near the German border. Fierce resistance erupted in places like Westerplatte, where outnumbered Polish defenders withstood German bombardment. Yet, despite their courage, they could not match the unwavering momentum of the Germans. Forced to retreat, the Polish forces regrouped in the southeast, preparing to make a stand at the Romanian bridgehead. But salvation never materialized. On September 17, 1939, the Soviet Union invaded Poland from the east under the guise of protecting ethnic Ukrainians and Belarusians. The Red Army swept across the border, smashing what remained of Poland's defenses. The country was now trapped between two merciless invaders, squeezed from both flanks in a coordinated pincer movement. By October 6th, just 35 days after the invasion began, Poland was defeated. Its armies were shattered, its government fled, and its territory was carved up by its enemies. The German and Soviet victors celebrated their conquest with a joint victory parade in the city of Brest, seemingly cementing the alliance between the two totalitarian regimes. For a brief moment, the pact between Germany and the Soviet Union appeared unbreakable, but this union was doomed from the start. Hitler's victories only fueled his hunger for further expansion, and the architect of Poland's destruction began eyeing his erstwhile ally as the next target. When the storm of Blitzkrieg turned eastward, it was the Soviet Union's turn to face the devastating wrath of Germany's war machine. A stab in the back. The signing of the non-aggression treaty between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union was a gamble that came back to haunt Soviet leader Joseph Stalin in the summer of 1941. Without warning or formal declaration of war, Adolf Hitler unleashed the full fury of the Wehrmacht on the Soviet Union. This was no ordinary assault. It was Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in military history. Germany mobilized an unparalleled force of 3.8 million soldiers, supported by 600,000 motor vehicles, 600,000 horses, and almost the entirety of the Luftwaffe. Stalin, wary of provoking his seemingly allied neighbor, had kept his troops unprepared for war. Despite some ongoing efforts to modernize, Soviet machinery lagged behind modern standards. Stalin constantly dismissed warnings of Germany's invasion, certain that his ally wouldn't turn against them. But the decision to invade the Soviet Union had already been taken, and by dawn of June 22, 1941, the skies over the Soviet Union were dominated by the engines of the Luftwaffe as they devastated Soviet airfields. Within hours, over 1,500 Soviet aircraft were obliterated, many destroyed before they could even take off. On the ground, the power of the German war machine pushed through. Artillery barrages pummeled Soviet border defenses, and armored spearheads, led by the Panzer divisions, tore through enemy lines. The Blitzkrieg moved with precision, encircling entire Soviet armies, bypassing strongholds, and plunging deep into Soviet territory. For Hitler, the Soviet Union was a fragile structure, waiting to be shattered by the hammer blow of his troops. Confident in a quick victory, he refused to equip his troops for winter, dismissing the possibility of prolonged resistance. But Hitler's confidence soon faced its first challenge. The city of Brest, where German and Soviet forces had once paraded together after their victory over Poland, became a battleground that would set the tone for the campaign. An endangered giant, the fortress of Brest was a monument to military engineering and the pride of the Soviet soldiers who came to defend it on the morning the Germans attacked. Rising from the ruins of a Renaissance-era castle, the edification preceded all troops within its walls. Its first stone was placed in 1833 by the Russian Empire, which aimed to build a giant fortress capable of defending the area's vital waterways and transportation routes. It was divided by rivers and artificial canals into 4 key islands: central, north, west, and south. At its core lay the citadel, a 2-story oval that encircled a courtyard, vast enough for the 12,000 soldiers who called the building home. Each island was fortified with embankments, standalone forts, and blockhouses bristling with artillery and supplies, with the North Island in particular featuring heavily armed forts that protected the approaches to the city of Brest. Its nearly 7-foot-thick walls enclosed 500 self-contained fighting compartments, each designed to withstand artillery fire and support a tenacious last-stand defense. However, despite its imposing architecture, the fortress's effectiveness as a stronghold had been gradually undermined by advances in military technology, and what had once been a bastion of defense lost its power over the advent of heavy artillery, tanks, and aircraft. The Wehrmacht had captured Brest during the invasion of Poland in 1939, and later handed it over to the Soviets under the terms of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. By the summer of 1941, the fortress's strategic location once again made it a key objective for the Germans as they launched their massive invasion of the Soviet Union. Approximately 9,000 soldiers were stationed in and around the fortress on the day Operation Barbarossa began. Over 400 officer families, along with medical staff and logistical personnel, accompanied the troops. Politically detained Polish prisoners of war and common criminals were also present in the old Brigittine Monastery on the North Island, which had been repurposed as a prison. All was quiet in the early hours of June 22nd, with most of the fortress's residents still asleep, unaware that the Germans already marched their way, set to recapture the fortress and wipe out any Soviet defense. A clash of former allies. Before the first rays of sunlight pierced the horizon, troops at Brest Fortress were awakened by German artillery. The first salvos hammered the thick walls, sending chunks of stone and mortar cascading onto unsuspecting soldiers below. Many Soviet troops never had the chance to reach their weapons, falling victim to collapsing walls and the fire of the Wehrmacht's guns. The border guards stationed at the gates were amongst the first responders. Refusing to be cowed by the sheer size and might of the German offensive, they seized their weapons and met the invaders head-on. Though they knew the odds were against them, the guards fought with all they had. One by one, they fell, their brave sacrifice buying the garrison precious time to mount a defense. On the West Island, Senior Lieutenant Alexander Potapov and border guard Andrei Kizhevatov orchestrated a counterattack that caught the Germans off guard. With rifles, bayonets, and even their bare hands, Soviet defenders ambushed enemy troops who had breached the Tiraspol Gate, forcing the Germans to retreat through brute force. The families of soldiers could not stand by while their home and loved ones were under attack. Women became ammunition runners and medics, tending to the wounded as shells fell around them. Children, too, took part in the defense, carrying food to soldiers and helping to keep track of the enemy's movements. The Germans, confident in the power of their Blitzkrieg tactics, had planned for the fortress to fall within 8 hours. Instead, they found themselves locked in a struggle against an enemy that refused to bow. As the hours stretched into days, the German high command grew increasingly frustrated. General Blumentritt, chief of staff of the German Fourth Army, would later admit, quote, "There we learned what it means to fight the Russian way." The Wehrmacht escalated its efforts to crush the fortress, showering down artillery and airstrikes on the citadel and its surrounding islands. Incendiary bombs set buildings ablaze, while tear gas was deployed to flush out defenders hiding in underground bunkers. Cut off from reinforcements and supplies, the Soviets sent desperate calls for help over radios, unaware that the entire region was facing the same merciless assault. Despite the isolation, Major Pyotr Gavrilov, commander of the 44th Rifle Regiment, refused to give up. He rallied scattered survivors on the North Island, forming them into small mobile fighting units. His men repurposed anti-aircraft guns for direct fire, holding their positions against German attacks. Their defiance became the cornerstone of the fortress's resistance. But the Soviet defense couldn't resist the force of the German invasion forever. By June 28th, German forces had reduced most of the fortress's strongholds to rubble. Artillery strikes and bombing runs from Juncker's Ju-88 aircraft delivered critical blows. Brest Fortress fell by the end of the month, but the last acts of resistance spanned until late July, with the last pockets of defense clinging to the hopes of Soviet resistance. On July 23rd, Major Gavrilov, who had evaded capture for weeks, was found emaciated and barely alive, keeping his promise to fight until the very end. He was captured and endured 4 years of captivity in German hands before being liberated by Allied forces in May 1945. Legacy carved in stone. After days of bombardment, the once impenetrable walls of Brest Fortress lay shattered, its interior a smoldering ruin. Among the thousands of Red Army defenders who stood against the tide of German invaders, only a fraction survived. But despite its fall, Brest Fortress became a symbol of Soviet resilience. Even in the face of overwhelming odds, the defenders' refusal to surrender delayed the German advance and shattered the illusion of an effortless march to the east. The message sent to Hitler was clear. The Soviets would not be easily broken. As German forces combed through the ruins of the fortress, they witnessed the last breath of the Soviet resistance. Messages carved into charred brick walls read, quote, "I am dying, but I do not surrender. Farewell, motherland." Initially, the scale of the German invasion and the rapid succession of battles that followed during the war's early years left little room to remember the heroism of Brest soldiers and civilians. However, after the war, Soviet historians and writers began to uncover the story of the fortress's defenders. In 1965, Brest Fortress was officially declared a hero fortress, one of the Soviet Union's highest honors. Today, the site stands as a memorial to the bravery of the soldiers who made the ultimate sacrifice to defend their country, the graffiti left by the defenders still up on the walls, proving that, in the end, Soviet resistance prevailed.